On October 25, 1861, a telegraph operator in San Francisco tapped out a message to President Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C. The message traveled 3,000 miles in seconds. California, separated from the East by months of dangerous travel, could now communicate instantly with the rest of the nation. Just 4 months earlier, there had been no telegraph line west of Omaha, Nebraska. Nothing but empty prairie, desert, and mountains for 2,000 miles. The Transcontinental Telegraph had been completed the day before, on October 24th. This is the story of how it got built. Not by engineers in offices, but by linemen living in dugout shelters along the route. Men who spent months setting poles in frozen ground, stringing wire across landscapes where no wire had ever been. Men who dealt with buffalo herds, hostile tribes, blizzards, and a silence so complete that the hum of the telegraph wire became the only sound for miles. It took 4 months to build. The moment it was completed, the Pony Express, which had been running for 18 months, shut down instantly. Obsolete overnight. This is the story of the Transcontinental Telegraph, the wire that killed distance. In 1860, if you wanted to send a message from New York to California, you had 3 options. You could send it by ship around South America, a journey of 3 to 6 months. You could send it overland by stagecoach, 3 to 4 weeks if nothing went wrong. Or you could use the new Pony Express, 10 days, weather permitting, for $5 per half-ounce letter. 10 days was revolutionary, but it still wasn't fast enough. By 1860, telegraph lines crisscrossed the eastern United States. You could send a message from New York to Chicago to St. Louis instantly. Business deals were made in hours instead of weeks. News traveled at the speed of electricity. The world was shrinking. But west of Omaha, nothing. California might as well have been on another continent. This created real problems. California had just become a state in 1850. Gold had been discovered in 1848. The population had exploded from 14,000 to over 300,000 in a decade. But California was isolated, militarily vulnerable, politically detached. When the Civil War began in April 1861, there was genuine concern that California might not stay with the Union. The state had Southern sympathizers. It had its own economy. And it took weeks for news from Washington to reach San Francisco. Congress authorized the Transcontinental Telegraph in 1860 with the Pacific Telegraph Act. They offered subsidies, $40,000 per year for 10 years to whichever companies could connect the coasts. They also offered land grants and the right to use public lands for poles and stations. 2 companies took the challenge. The Pacific Telegraph Company, backed by Western Union, would build west from Omaha. The Overland Telegraph Company would build east from Carson City, Nevada. They'd meet somewhere in the middle of Utah Territory. It was a race, and it started on July 4, 1861. Building a telegraph line across settled country was already difficult. Building one across 2,000 miles of wilderness was nearly impossible. The basic requirements were simple: poles, wire, and insulators. But getting those materials to the middle of nowhere was the real challenge. Poles had to be set every 200 to 300 feet. That meant roughly 27,500 poles across the entire route. In forested areas, you could cut local timber. But across the Great Plains and through Nevada's deserts, there were no trees. Every pole had to be hauled by wagon from hundreds of miles away. The wire itself was iron, not copper. Copper was too expensive. The iron wire came in coils weighing about 150 pounds each. It took approximately 2,000 miles of wire to span the distance, accounting for slack and repairs. All of it had to be transported by ox-drawn wagons moving at 2 miles per hour. The insulators were glass or porcelain knobs that kept the wire from grounding out on the wooden poles. They were fragile. They broke constantly during transport. The wagons carried thousands of them. Then there was the landscape itself. West from Omaha, the route followed the Platte River through Nebraska. then angled northwest into Wyoming territory. It crossed the Continental Divide at South Pass, the same route used by the Oregon Trail emigrants. Then it dropped down into Utah territory across the Great Basin Desert, over the Sierra Nevada mountains, and into California. The eastern cruise faced prairie, flat, treeless, and wind-scoured, digging holes for poles in frozen ground during winter, dealing with sudden blizzards, watching for Sioux and Cheyenne war parties who saw the telegraph as an invasion of their hunting grounds. The western cruise faced desert and mountains, alkali flats where nothing grew, mountain passes where snow could fall in July, Paiute and Shoshone bands who were sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile, and always wary of the white men stringing wire across their land. Both crews faced the same basic problem. They were building infrastructure in places where there was no infrastructure to support the building. The actual construction crews were surprisingly small. Each section gang consisted of about 10 to 15 men, pole setters, wire stringers, a foreman, and usually a few armed guards. The work followed a rhythm that repeated every day, mile after mile, for months. First, scouts would ride ahead to mark the route. They'd look for the straightest, flattest path. They'd note water sources. They'd check for hostile Indians. Every few miles, they'd stake a marker. Behind them came the pole wagons. Where trees were available, men would cut and trim poles on site. Where there were no trees, the wagons carried pre-cut poles, usually pine or cedar, about 20 to 30 feet tall, 8 to 12 inches thick at the base. The pole-setting crew would dig a hole about 4 to 5 feet deep. In soft soil, this took an hour. In hard ground or rock, it could take half a day. They'd wrestle the pole upright, several men pushing, one man guiding, and pack dirt and rocks around the base. Once the pole was set, they'd attach the glass insulator near the top. The insulator was critical. Without it, the electric current would ground out through the wet wood and the telegraph wouldn't work. Then came the wire crew. They'd uncoil the iron wire from the wagon, feed it through the insulators on the new pole, and tie it off. The wire had to be tight enough not to sag excessively, but loose enough to allow for expansion and contraction with temperature changes. Get it wrong, and the wire would snap in winter or droop to the ground in summer. Good crews could set 10 to 15 poles per day in favorable conditions. In reality, 5 to 7 poles was more common. That meant covering about a mile per day, sometimes less. At night, the crews camped along the line. They lived in tents in summer, dugouts in winter. The dugouts were holes dug into hillsides or stream banks roofed with logs and dirt, dark, damp, cold, but better than freezing to death in a tent during a blizzard. Food was basic: beans, salt pork, flour for biscuits, coffee, fresh meat when they could hunt buffalo or antelope. Water was often alkaline, barely drinkable. The work was monotonous: dig hole, set pole, string wire, move forward, repeat, day after day, week after week. The landscape changed, but the work didn't. And always the silence. Out on the prairie or in the desert, there were no towns, no people, no sounds except wind and the occasional creak of the telegraph wire as it settled on the insulators. Some linemen later said the hum of the completed telegraph wire, that faint singing sound when wind blew across it, was the most beautiful thing they'd ever heard. It meant they weren't alone anymore. The wire connected them to civilization, even if that civilization was hundreds of miles away. Buffalo were a constant problem for the Eastern crews, not because buffalo attacked the men, but because buffalo destroyed the line. Telegraph poles made excellent scratching posts. A full-grown buffalo bull could weigh 2,000 pounds. When a herd of buffalo decided to scratch themselves on newly set poles, the poles went down, sometimes dozens at a time. The linemen would set poles, buffalo would knock them down. The linemen would set them again, this time bracing them with rocks and guy wires. Buffalo would push through the wires. Eventually, the crews learned to set poles extra deep and extra strong in buffalo country and to string the wire higher to keep the buffalo from getting tangled. But even that didn't always work. One crew reported finding an entire mile of line knocked flat by a stampeding herd. The wire was tangled, the poles were broken, and the insulators were shattered. They spent 3 days rebuilding that mile. Native American tribes posed a more complex problem. Some tribes were curious but peaceful. They'd watch the work from a distance. Occasionally they'd trade with the crews, fresh meat for tobacco or metal tools. The Shoshone were generally friendly. So were some Paiute bands. Other tribes were hostile. They saw the telegraph as another white invasion. First had come the emigrants on the Oregon Trail, destroying grass and game. Then came the Pony Express riders. Now came men with wire, claiming land, building permanent structures. Some tribes believed the wire carried bad medicine. They thought it could spread disease or bring drought. Others simply wanted the white men gone and saw the telegraph as a target. Attacks on telegraph crews were relatively rare. The armed guards deterred most raids, but sabotage was common. Tribes would cut the wire at night. They'd pull down poles. They'd steal insulators and wire for their own use. One particularly clever form of sabotage, cutting the wire and grounding both ends in the earth. The telegraph would stop working, but when the repair crew arrived, they'd find the wire intact. It would take hours to trace the line and find the break. Weather was perhaps the worst obstacle. Summer heat in the desert could reach 120 degrees. Men died of heat stroke. Winter cold on the plains could drop to 30 below zero. Men lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Rain turned the prairie into mud that could bog down wagons for days. Snow blocked mountain passes. Wind knocked down poles. Lightning strikes could melt the wire or shatter insulators. And there were accidents. Men fell from poles. Wagons overturned. Tools slipped. One lineman was killed when a pole he was setting fell and crushed him. Another died when his horse spooked and threw him onto rocks. But they kept working, because this was the job, and because stopping meant the other crew might reach the connection point first. Both companies pushed hard. The Western Union crew building west from Omaha had Edward Creighton as their chief engineer. Creighton was a veteran telegraph builder who'd already built lines across the Midwest. He knew what he was doing. The Overland Telegraph crew building east from Nevada had James Gamble as superintendent. Gamble was equally experienced and equally determined. Neither man could afford to fail. The company that reached the midpoint first would get bragging rights. More importantly, they'd prove their competence for future contracts. The Eastern crew had the advantage of following the Oregon Trail, which meant there were established stops every 50 to 100 miles where they could resupply. But they faced longer distances and harsher plains weather. The Western crew had shorter distances but harder terrain. The Sierra Nevada was brutal. The Nevada desert was unforgiving. But California's wealth meant they had better access to supplies and labor. Through summer and into fall of 1861, both crews drove forward. 10 miles one day, 5 the next, 15 if conditions were perfect, 0 when a blizzard hit or when they ran out of poles. As the crews got closer, they could test the line. Telegraph operators would tap out messages. At first, the signals were weak, barely readable, but as the gap closed, the signals grew stronger. On October 24, 1861, near Salt Lake City, the two lines connected. The crews met, shook hands, and spliced the final section of wire. The Transcontinental Telegraph was complete. 4 months after starting, 3,000 miles of wire now connected the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. The first transcontinental telegram went from Chief Justice Stephen J. Field in San Francisco to President Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C. It pledged California's loyalty to the Union. The telegraph had accomplished in seconds what would have taken weeks by Pony Express or months by ship. The Pony Express shut down 2 days after the telegraph was completed. It had run for exactly 18 months. It was romantic, it was daring, and it was instantly obsolete. The telegraph changed everything. California was no longer isolated. Business could be conducted at the speed of electricity. News traveled instantly. Military orders reached the West Coast in minutes instead of weeks. During the Civil War, the telegraph became a strategic asset. Lincoln could communicate with his generals in near real time. The Union could coordinate military movements across a continent. The Confederacy had telegraph lines too, but they were shorter, more vulnerable, and more easily disrupted. For the linemen who built it, life didn't get easier. They became maintenance crews. The line needed constant repair. Wind, weather, buffalo, and sabotage kept them busy year-round. Telegraph stations were established every 50 to 100 miles along the line. These were usually small wooden buildings or dugouts where an operator would live, sometimes alone, sometimes with a family. Their job was to relay messages and report line breaks. The life of a telegraph operator on the frontier was profoundly lonely. You'd sit in a small station in the middle of nowhere, listening to the telegraph sounder click out messages in Morse code. You'd relay those messages to the next station. You'd send messages from local settlers when they rode in, which might be once a week or once a month. The rest of the time, silence. Just you, the wind, and that faint singing hum of the telegraph wire. Some operators went years without seeing more than a handful of people. Some went mad from the isolation. Others found peace in it. One operator wrote that he preferred the company of the telegraph to the company of men. At least the telegraph was honest. By the time the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, the telegraph had been running for 8 years. The railroad followed almost the same route, and telegraph poles were strung alongside the tracks. Better poles, better wire, better maintenance. The original 1861 line was gradually replaced, section by section, but it had done its job. It had proven that instant communication across a continent was possible. It had kept California in the Union during the Civil War, and it had made the West feel less distant. The Transcontinental Telegraph lasted barely 8 years before being superseded by better technology. But in those 8 years, it fundamentally changed how Americans thought about distance. Before the telegraph, distance meant time. 3,000 miles meant months of travel. After the telegraph, distance became almost irrelevant for information. A message sent from San Francisco arrived in New York as quickly as a message sent from Philadelphia. This changed business, politics, news, and daily life. Prices for goods in California could be adjusted daily based on Eastern markets. Politicians in Washington could make decisions about the West with current information. Newspapers could print news from across the continent within hours of it happening. The telegraph also changed warfare. The Civil War was the first American war fought with instant communication. Commanders could coordinate movements across hundreds of miles. Intelligence could be transmitted immediately. The telegraph became as important as rifles and cannons. For the men who built it, the telegraph was just a job. Hard work, decent pay, and a lot of time alone on the prairie or in the desert. Most of them moved on to other work. Some became railroad workers when the Transcontinental Railroad was built. Others went back to farming or mining. A few stayed on as telegraph operators or maintenance crews. Their names are mostly forgotten. Edward Creighton is remembered because he founded Creighton University in Omaha with his telegraph fortune. But the hundreds of linemen who actually strung the wire, history didn't record most of their names. What we do know is this: in the summer and fall of 1861, while the nation was tearing itself apart in civil war, a few hundred men worked quietly to connect the coasts. They set 27,500 poles. They strung 2,000 miles of wire. They lived in dugouts and tents. They dealt with buffalo, blizzards, and occasional attacks. They worked from sunrise to sunset, day after day, for months. And on October 24th, 1861, they finished. The wire hummed, the telegraph clicked, and for the first time, California and the East could talk to each other instantly. The linemen packed up their tools and moved on to the next job. Because that's what they did. They built things. And once a thing was built, they built the next thing. The Transcontinental Telegraph was operational for barely 8 years before being replaced. But it changed the world. It killed distance. it connected a nation. And it proved that even the most impossible infrastructure projects could be accomplished with enough determination, enough labor, and enough wire. The men who built it never saw themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as workers, doing a job, setting poles, stringing wire, moving forward. But what they built connected a continent. And for that, even if we don't know their names, we should remember what they did.